So, look, Australia, right? Everybody knows it as that place with the insane wildlife, the deadly spiders, the snakes that can drop you in minutes, and sharks that treat surfers like appetizers. Beautiful country though, absolutely gorgeous. White beaches that stretch forever, rainforests that look like something out of a movie, and landscapes so stunning you forget for a second that everything there is actively trying to end you. But here is the thing that nobody really talks about, and honestly, it is kind of wild when you think about it. As dangerous as Australia is today, and trust me, it is pretty gnarly with more animal-related incidents than countries 13 times its size, it used to be so much worse, like exponentially worse, and I am not talking about 50 years ago or even 500 years ago. I am talking about a time when Australia was not just dangerous on land, but had an entire inland sea that was basically nature's Thunderdome. Yeah, you heard that right. An inland sea in Australia, and it was not some peaceful little lake where you could go for a swim and maybe see some fish. No, this thing was packed wall to wall with some of the most nightmarish predators that have ever existed on this planet. We are talking creatures that make great white sharks look cuddly. Animals so big and terrifying that if you somehow got dropped into these waters, you would have maybe 30 seconds before something decided you looked tasty. And the craziest part, this was not even that long ago in geological terms, just over 100 million years back during a time called the Cretaceous, which you probably know as the Dinosaur era. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's why I make them. So subscribe maybe, tell me where you're at and the time. Comments are like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. Now most people when they think Cretaceous, they picture T-Rex stomping around, velociraptors causing chaos, you know the classics, but what they do not realise is that while all that was happening on land, there was this entire other world happening in the water. And in Australia specifically, there was this massive body of water called the Eromanga Sea. Never heard of it? Yeah, most people have not. But you are about to learn why it was probably the single most terrifying place to take a dip in Earth's entire history. So here is what you need to understand about Australia during this time. Today, only about 4% of the continent is covered by water. It is mostly a dry place, deserts and scrubland, beautiful but harsh. But back in the Cretaceous, especially during the early part of it, over 50% of the landmass was underwater, half the continent just gone. Swallowed up by this enormous inland sea that stretched from the north coast all the way down to a town that would eventually be called Eromanga, which, fun fact, is the furthest point from any ocean in Australia. That is where the name comes from. The sea itself was massive. At its widest point, it stretched over 2,000 kilometres, or about 1,200 miles. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the same size as the Sea of Japan. But unlike the Sea of Japan, which is deep and connected to the ocean, the Eromanga Sea was shallow, really shallow. In some spots, just a few metres deep. But what it lacked in depth it made up for in pure area and in the sheer number of things living in it that wanted to eat you. Now you might be thinking, okay, shallow, warm inland sea, that does not sound so bad. Maybe some gentle marine life, some turtles, whatever. Wrong. See, the Eromanga Sea was not some tropical paradise. The water was murky, almost muddy. Visibility was terrible. The water was cold, especially toward the southern end where temperatures could drop near freezing during winter. This was because Australia was positioned differently back then, further south than it is now. So you had this weird situation where you had a massive inland sea that was cold, murky, and filled with sediment, not exactly inviting. But here is where it gets interesting. That murky, sediment-rich water, turns out it was perfect for supporting an absolutely insane amount of life. The sediments were loaded with organic material and iron, which created these rich coastal habitats. Rivers fed into the sea, bringing nutrients. Different water depths created different ecological zones, and all of this combined to make the Eromanga Sea one of the most biodiverse and active places on the entire planet during the Cretaceous. It was basically the Serengeti of the underwater world, except everything had teeth and most things were bigger than a bus. The absolute peak of this nightmare was during something called the Albian Stage, which ran from about 113 million years ago to 100 million years ago. 13 million years of pure aquatic chaos, and sitting at the top of the food chain, the undisputed king of this underwater hellscape was something called Chronosaurus. And oh man, where do we even start with this thing? Chronosaurus was a plesiosaur. Now, if you are not familiar with plesiosaurs, think of them as the ocean's answer to T-Rex, except they lived way before T-Rex was even a thing, and they were arguably scarier. Plesiosaurs were these massive marine reptiles with enormous heads, thick, powerful bodies, and 4 giant flippers that let them cruise through the water with terrifying speed and grace. They were the apex predators of the Jurassic period, and while most of them had died out by the Cretaceous, a few hung on, and in the Eromanga Sea they absolutely thrived. Chronosaurus was not just any plesiosaur, it was one of the biggest. Adults regularly hit 11 meters long, that is about 36 feet, and weighed over 15 tons. To put that in perspective, that is heavier than most of the giant mosasaurs that would come later. The ones you see in movies, chomping on everything. Chronosaurus was built like a tank, but moved like a torpedo, and there is evidence suggesting some individuals got even bigger. We have found specimens that suggest sizes up to 13 meters or 43 feet. That is as long as some grey whales. Let that sink in for a second. A predator as long as a grey whale living in a relatively shallow inland sea hunting anything that moved. The head alone on these things was absurd. We have found Chronosaurus skulls that are bigger than any T-Rex skull ever discovered, except for maybe some of the huge ceratopsian dinosaurs. One specimen has a head a third longer than the biggest T-Rex skull on record. And that head was not just for show. It was a killing machine. 6 pairs of massive conical teeth, each one pointed and recurved, with grooves running along them. These teeth were designed to punch deep into prey and hold on. The base of each tooth was incredibly wide, which tells paleontologists that Chronosaurus was specialized for taking down large animals, not fish, not squid, big stuff. And the bite force? Absolutely insane. Studies suggest an adult Chronosaurus could deliver over 27,000 newtons of force per bite. That is 18 times stronger than a tiger's bite. Enough to punch straight through tough hide, muscle and bone like it was tissue paper. If Chronosaurus got its jaws on you, there was no escape. You were done. But here is what makes Chronosaurus even more terrifying. It was not some slow ambush predator sitting on the bottom waiting for prey to swim by. No, this thing was active. Studies of its bone growth show it had an extremely high metabolism, similar to modern birds. That means it needed to eat constantly. We are talking tons of food per day just to keep going. And that high metabolism meant it could handle the cold water in the southern parts of the Eromanga Sea, where most other large predators would not go. So if you thought you could escape to the chilly shallows, think again. Chronosaurus would follow you there and still be just as fast and deadly. The fossil record backs this up. We have found remains of all kinds of animals with Chronosaurus bite marks on them. Giant turtles, other plesiosaurs, large fish, squid, marine reptiles that were 60% of Chronosaurus's own size. And here is the kicker. Dinosaurs. Yeah, actual dinosaurs, meaning Chronosaurus was not just hunting in the water, it was grabbing things off the shore or snatching them when they got too close. Nothing was safe. But you know what is really messed up? Chronosaurus's biggest threat was not some other species, it was other Chronosaurus. Cannibalism was rampant. Most of the juvenile specimens we find show signs of being eaten by larger individuals. There is one famous fossil of a 6-meter-long teenager, about 20 feet, that was found with its head completely missing, not scattered bones, just gone, eaten. The rest of the body was nowhere to be found either, suggesting the whole thing got dragged off and consumed by a bigger Chronosaurus. This kind of behaviour has led researchers to compare Chronosaurus to modern saltwater crocodiles, which are notorious for attacking anything and everything, including each other, except Chronosaurus was about 23 times heavier than a big saltwater croc. Imagine a saltwater crocodile, which is already one of the most dangerous predators on Earth, but scaled up to the size of a semi-truck. That was Chronosaurus. So yeah, if you are keeping score, the Eromanga Sea had a top predator that was bigger than most mosasaurs, had a bite force that could crush bone, needed to eat constantly, did not care what it attacked, and regularly ate its own young. Great place for a swim, right? But wait, it gets better, because Chronosaurus was not alone up there at the top. Despite being the biggest and baddest, there were other predators in the Eromanga Sea that were willing to challenge it, and some of them even took bites out of Chronosaurus itself. Talk about having some nerve, right? So what kind of animal would be crazy enough or hungry enough to mess with Chronosaurus? Well, you do not have to look far for the answer, because we have that exact same predator in our oceans today. Sharks. Yeah, sharks. And not just any sharks, but some seriously heavy hitters. See, during the early Cretaceous, sharks had not quite reached the level of dominance they have today. They were still recovering from some mass extinction events and had not fully taken over the oceans yet. But in the Eromanga Sea, they were absolutely killing it. Pun intended. The cold, murky, closed-off waters of this inland sea created the perfect environment for sharks to thrive, and they were everywhere. Every corner of the sea had sharks cruising around looking for their next meal. The most successful group in the Eromanga Sea were the lamniform sharks, which you probably know better as mackerel sharks. These are the same family that includes modern great whites, makos, and salmon sharks. They are characterized by having 2 dorsal fins, an anal fin, 5 gill slits, and a mouth that extends way back past the eyes. And they are aggressive, like really aggressive. Their scientific name literally means fish of prey, which should tell you everything you need to know about their temperament. We know these sharks were mixing it up with Chronosaurus because we have found Chronosaurus fossils with shark bite marks on them. Specifically, we have got a Chronosaurus jaw with clear shark-shaped bites on it. Now, the individual in question was on the smaller side, and the bites were not fatal, which suggests sharks were targeting young Chronosaurus. Makes sense, right? You do not want to mess with a fully grown 15-ton murder machine, but a younger one that is only a few meters long. That is fair game, and sure enough, we have found multiple juvenile Chronosaurus specimens with shark bites on them. But it was not just Chronosaurus getting chomped. Tons of large fish from the Eromanga Sea show evidence of being attacked and partially eaten by sharks. And among all the sharks cruising around causing mayhem, one type stands out as particularly nasty, a Ichthyosaurs-like shark. Now, if you know anything about the Western Interior Seaway, which was this massive inland sea that covered the middle of North America during the Cretaceous, then you have probably heard of Ichthyosaurs. It was an absolute monster. This shark could reach massive sizes and was capable of bursts of speed over 70 kilometers per hour or about 43 miles per hour. It used rows of giant serrated teeth to cause catastrophic bleeding and trauma in its prey, and those teeth were so sharp and effective that people nicknamed it the Ginsu shark after those infomercial knives. The version in the Eromanga Sea might not have been the exact same species as the American Cretoxorhina, but it was definitely a close relative. Sister species, maybe, or just a closely related family member, and in true Australian fashion, it was even deadlier than its North American cousin. The teeth were similar in design but longer. The body was bigger. Mature specimens reached around 9 meters long, that is about 30 feet, and weighed over 6 tons. That made it one of the largest sharks to ever exist, period. It makes modern great whites, which Australians already have to deal with, look like minnows. Why were sharks so successful in the Eromanga Sea when they were struggling elsewhere? Well, one theory is that their incredible sensory abilities gave them an edge in the murky water. Sharks can detect electrical fields, sense vibrations, smell blood from miles away. In water where you can barely see a few feet in front of you, those abilities would have been game changers, or maybe it was just something about the Eromanga Sea itself. Because there was definitely a pattern of animals thriving there that were not doing so hot anywhere else. And that brings us to another group, the Ichthyosaurs. Ichthyosaurs were these dolphin-like marine reptiles that ruled the oceans during the Triassic and Jurassic periods. They were fast, efficient predators that dominated the seas for millions of years, but by the early Cretaceous they were in trouble. Climate changes and other factors were causing their populations to crash, and they were on their way out, except in the Eromanga Sea. There, they were making one last stand. They were thriving, reaching sizes that had not been seen since the Jurassic, and carving out a solid niche for themselves despite everything working against them elsewhere. Eromanga ichthyosaurs had diverse diets, lots of fish of course, occasional marine reptiles if they could catch them, but mostly squid. We have found ichthyosaur fossils with their stomachs literally packed full of belemnites, which are these squid-like creatures that were super common back then. Some specimens had swallowed them whole, dozens at a time. Now, despite being reptiles, ichthyosaurs looked remarkably similar to dolphins, and that was not just a coincidence. It was convergent evolution at work. Their bodies were perfectly designed for speed. The ratio between their length and depth was right in that sweet spot between 3 and 5, which is ideal for reducing drag and water resistance. They had smooth skin, compact, streamlined bodies, and large tail flukes. All of this made them some of the fastest swimmers in Australian waters. About 20% faster than any other marine reptile in the region. If you had taken a swim in the Eromanga Sea, you would have seen several types of ichthyosaurs zipping around, but one genus dominated, Platypterygius. This was by far the most common ichthyosaur in the sea. It specialized in deep diving, using its large eyes to spot prey in the murky depths, and its curved, toothy snout to snatch them up. And despite being built for speed, Platypterygius was huge. Over 7 meters long, about 23 feet, which gave it both defensive and offensive capabilities against medium-sized predators. Its teeth were mainly designed for softer prey like squid, but its size meant it could occasionally take down bigger targets. Large proto-turtles. Even birds, because we have found bird remains in Platypterygius stomachs. But being big came with risks, because while Platypterygius could handle most threats, it was not safe from the true giants like Chronosaurus. We have found Platypterygius fossils that show signs of being attacked and partially eaten by plesiosaurs, and interestingly, both ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs seem to prefer the southern parts of the sea, the colder areas. They stuck close to those shores right up until the end. In fact, the ichthyosaurs in the Eromanga Sea were among the very last of their kind to ever exist. So the Eromanga Sea had achieved quite a reputation through its massive predators, giant plesiosaurs, enormous sharks, speedy Ichthyosaurs, all competing for the title of most terrifying thing in the water. But here is the thing about Australia, both then and now. It does not just specialise in big scary animals, it also perfects the art of making creatures that are just downright disturbing to look at, like stuff that makes you go, why would evolution do that? And the fish situation in the Eromanga Sea was a perfect example of this. For the most part, the fish were actually pretty normal. You had your standard varieties, lots of different types swimming around living their best lives, halicomorphs, elopomorphs, some early teleosts. Basically the ancestors of fish groups we still have today. Nothing too crazy. But every once in a while, evolution would take a hard left turn and produce something that looked like it crawled out of a nightmare. Take this one fish that was similar to a modern-day gulper eel. This thing grew to over 8 feet long, about 2.5 meters, and had this massive, ugly mouth that could open wide enough to swallow prey nearly its own size. Yeah, do the math on that. If it could eat something almost as big as itself and it was 8 feet long, that means it could potentially gulp down a human-sized meal without even chewing. Just open up and down the hatch. This fish liked to hang out near the surface and was found pretty much everywhere in the sea. Narrow straits, possibly brackish water, did not matter. Where there was water, there was this thing floating around with its horrifying face. But as unsettling as the gulper fish was, it was nothing compared to what came next. Swordfish. Now I know what you are thinking. Swordfish? Those are pretty normal. Kind of cool actually with their long bills. And you would be right about modern swordfish. They are a bit odd looking, but not really scary. But the swordfish relatives living in the Cretaceous Eromanga Sea were messed up for a completely different reason. Their teeth. This probably sounds weird because modern swordfish do not have teeth at all. They are toothless, but back in the Cretaceous, Australia had these swimming dental nightmares that were only distantly related to true swordfish. They belonged to an extinct group called pachycormiforms, and the Australian species was named Protosphaerina. And oh man, the teeth on this thing. They were shaped like flat blades, perfect for slicing, and they were just as long as the teeth you would find in giant theropod dinosaurs many times bigger than this fish. In fact, when paleontologists first discovered these teeth, they thought they had found a new dinosaur. Nope. Just a deeply disturbing fish. The other weird thing about Protosphaerina was its bill. Unlike modern swordfish, which have these long extended rostrums, this thing had a much shorter face. You might think that is better, right? Less attack range, less dangerous. Wrong. That short face actually made it worse, and here is why. Through convergent evolution, Protosphaerina had developed a body plan similar to modern swordfish. Very streamlined, massive fins, built for pure speed. This fish could hit speeds greater than 55 miles per hour, or about 88 kilometers per hour. That is faster than most cars drive in a city. And what did it use that speed for? Torpedoing itself directly into prey. The force would be concentrated into its blade-like teeth and short spear face, and the result was that victims would literally get sliced in half. Not bitten, not crushed, sliced clean through like a hot knife through butter. Adults reached about 3 meters long, around 10 feet, so while not as massive as the plesiosaurs or sharks, Protosphaerina was absolutely not something you wanted to encounter. Especially if it decided you looked like lunch and started accelerating toward you at highway speeds. Now ironically, while fish like Protosphaerina were terrifying killers, there was another group in the sea that looked even scarier, but were actually way more harmless. Plesiosaurs. Yeah, those long-necked marine reptiles that everybody pictures when they think of the Loch Ness Monster. In the Eromanga Sea, plesiosaurs were incredibly successful. In fact, from a pure diversity standpoint, they were the most successful marine group in the entire ecosystem. They came in all different sizes, from massive 2-ton individuals measuring 7 meters or 23 feet long down to smaller ones barely longer than a person. But here is what made plesiosaurs special. Unlike pretty much every other major predator in the sea, they were not limited to salt water. Pliosaurs like Chronosaurus needed salt or brackish water. Sharks needed salt or brackish water. Ichthyosaurs needed salt or brackish water. Most fish needed salt or brackish water. But plesiosaurs, they could handle all of it. Salt, brackish, and fresh water. They could travel up the rivers that fed into the Eromanga Sea and set up shop wherever they wanted. This adaptability meant plesiosaurs could populate way more environments than anything else, and it also meant that even the narrowest little waterway could potentially have a multi-ton predator hiding in it. So, yeah, no thanks. What made them such good hunters, despite not being the apex predators, was a combination of features: strong flippers for propulsion, keen eyesight for spotting prey, bodies designed to reduce drag, and of course those iconic long necks. See, the neck was not just for looks, it was a stealth weapon. Plesiosaurs could drift along with their bodies below the surface and snake that long neck towards schools of fish without spooking them. Then bam, mouths full of dozens of small pointed teeth would snap up fish and squid before they even knew what hit them. The teeth were not designed for bringing down huge prey. They were precision tools for catching fish and cephalopods, but despite being so well designed and efficient, plesiosaurs still ended up as food for a lot of the bigger predators. We have found plesiosaur remains with bite marks from Chronosaurus, sharks, and other large hunters. When you have an ecosystem where the majority of animals are carnivores, which the Eromanga Sea definitely was, nothing gets to be completely safe. Everything is food for something. But here is where things get interesting. Despite the ridiculous number of predators, the Eromanga Sea still managed to support a surprising number of relatively peaceful creatures: giant turtles, huge cephalopods the size of grown men, schools and schools of fish, jellyfish, ammonites, bivalves, snails, rays. The diversity was insane. This made the Eromanga Sea one of the liveliest bodies of water on the entire planet. It was not just a death trap. It was a thriving, complex ecosystem with every niche filled. Now you would think that with all these aquatic horrors, animals on land would have learned to stay far away from the water. But no, they were drawn to it like moths to a flame. The coasts of the Eromanga Sea and the surrounding environments were just as packed with life as the water itself. And there were several reasons for this. The sea provided food directly for certain animals, fish, obviously, but it also created a bunch of different habitat types: coastal forests, wetlands, mangroves, mudflats, marshes. All of these were resource-rich environments that could support tons of terrestrial life. But just because you made it out of the water did not mean you were safe. Not even close, because some of the scariest creatures living around the Eromanga Sea were not in the water at all. They were above it, flying. The skies were dominated by pterosaurs, and they were absolutely massive. The fish in the sea provided endless meals, and that abundance of food allowed pterosaurs to reach truly absurd sizes. The Eromanga Basin was home to some of the largest toothed pterosaurs that ever existed. One type, called Ferrodraco, had a wingspan over 7 meters, about 23 feet. That is twice the wingspan of the largest bird alive today, and there is evidence it might have gotten even bigger, potentially up to 31 feet or 9.5 meters across. At that size, even though its diet was mainly fish, you probably would not be taking much comfort in that fact if one flew overhead. A playful nip with its needle-like teeth would ruin your whole day. Over 4 different kinds of these giant pterosaurs lived in the Eromanga area, and they were everywhere. You could not go a single day without seeing one of these massive creatures soaring over the water or diving down to snatch fish from the surface. They were a bit of a dying breed, though. These were among the last pterosaurs to still have teeth, which they used for catching fish. Most pterosaur lineages were moving toward toothless beaks, but these Australian giants held onto their dental weaponry right up until the end. On the shorelines, pterosaurs shared space with another group that has remained a staple in Australia ever since, crocodilians. 2 genera have been found in the fossil record so far, Isisfordia and Confractosuchus. Interestingly, neither of these have been found in the saltwater areas of the Eromanga Sea itself. They seemed to prefer the rivers that fed into it. But paleontologists believe that, like modern saltwater crocs, these ancient relatives probably ventured between fresh, brackish and saltwater pretty regularly. They used ambush tactics, lurking near the water's edge and grabbing animals that got too close, or sometimes snatching marine creatures right out of the water. Isisfordia had a narrow snout, suggesting it specialized in fish. Confractosuchus had wider jaws, more like modern crocodiles, indicating a more generalized diet. The good news, if you can call it that, is that neither of these crocs were supersized like some of their relatives elsewhere. Isisfordia only measured about 1 meter or 3.3 feet. Confractosuchus was bigger at around 2.5 meters, about 8 feet. So roughly the size of a large Komodo dragon. Not small by any means, but not the monstrous 20-foot-plus crocodilians that existed in other parts of the world during the Cretaceous. But what they lacked in size, they made up for with appetite, especially Confractosuchus. The skull shape and jaw mechanics suggest these crocs regularly hunted animals bigger than themselves, and we have direct evidence. One specimen was found with an ornithopod dinosaur in its stomach. Another was discovered right next to a sauropod carcass it had apparently been scavenging. So yeah, these relatively small crocs were taking down or at least eating dinosaurs, because of course they were. It is Australia. Speaking of dinosaurs, despite all the focus on the marine life and the flying reptiles and the crocodiles, it was still dinosaurs that absolutely dominated the land around the Eromanga Sea, and they were everywhere. The sea had created this incredibly resource-rich environment, and dinosaurs took full advantage. Additionally, the sea likely formed various islands and cut off sections of land, forcing dinosaurs to cross water or walk along beaches to get where they needed to go. Fossil evidence shows that virtually every type of dinosaur lived near the Eromanga Sea, but sauropods, the long-necked giants, were particularly common. And these were not just any sauropods, they were titanosaurs, the group that holds the record for the largest land animals to ever exist. At least 5 different genera made the land around the Eromanga Sea their home: Diamantinosaurus, Savannosaurus, Winternotitan, Ostrosaurus, and the big one Australotitan. Each of these was well over 10 tons, but Australotitan was in a league of its own. This thing might have weighed more than 70 tons and reached 30 metres long, that is about 100 feet, the biggest Australian animal ever, roughly 7 times the size of a large elephant. These absolute units probably fed on the trees and vegetation provided by the coastal forests. Based on where fossils have been found, they typically stayed near rivers and beaches, and there is evidence that sauropods dying close to the shore was pretty common. Waves would eventually drag the carcasses out into the sea, where they would sink to the bottom and become food for the entire underwater community, basically prehistoric whale falls. Track fossils suggest groups of sauropods often walked along the coast, which meant they were regularly coming into close contact with marine life. And sure enough, we have found Chronosaurus fossils, shark fossils, and plesiosaur fossils, all in relatively close proximity to sauropod skeletons. The borders between land and sea were fuzzy, and animals from both worlds interacted constantly. The sauropods shared the landscape with other herbivorous dinosaurs too. Various types of ornithopods, those bipedal plant eaters, Muttaburrasaurus, which was this larger ornithopod found in the region, ankylosaurs with their armoured bodies, multiple unidentified species. The herbivore diversity was impressive, but of course, where there are plant eaters, there are meat eaters, and the theropod dinosaurs prowling the coastlines of the Eromanga Sea were arguably the worst kind possible. Megaraptorans. If you have heard about these before, you know why I say worst. If you have not, buckle up. Megaraptorans were a group of carnivorous dinosaurs that had absolutely massive sickle claws. But unlike the famous velociraptor and its relatives, Megaraptorans did not have these claws on their feet. They had them on their hands. Combined with extremely powerful arms, this meant Megaraptorans could essentially become slashing nightmares, using those giant hand claws to impale and tear apart prey while it was still alive. And because Megaraptorans had hollow bones that made them much lighter than they should have been for their size, they were fast, really fast. Basically the cheetahs of the Cretaceous, except way more horrifying. In true Australian fashion, there were not just one, but multiple Megaraptorans living around the Eromanga Sea. At least one has been identified and named, while others remain undescribed. The named species is Australovenator, which translates to southern hunter. Fitting name. It is the largest Australian theropod discovered so far, weighing around 310 kilograms or 680 pounds and reaching 6 meters or 20 feet long. If this thing spotted you at close range, you were probably done. No way you are outrunning it. And you would not just have to worry about those hand claws. Australovenator also had serrated, recurved teeth perfect for slicing through flesh. Once it got hold of you, it was game over. It is only natural that prehistoric Australia would have land predators nearly as disturbing as the aquatic ones, and even though they have not been found directly in the Eromanga Basin, there is a strong possibility that other types of theropods were in the area too. Megaraptorans were definitely there, but fossils of other groups like abelisaurids and early tyrannosaurs have been found not too far away. The surrounding land was probably just as much of a death trap as the sea itself. Now here is where things get even more intense, if you can believe that is possible, because on top of all the predators in the water, and all the predators on land, and all the predators in the sky, there was one more threat that made the Eromanga Sea particularly nasty. Mother Nature herself. See, the early Cretaceous in Australia was not exactly a stable time environmentally. The whole region was going through some serious geological drama, and that meant frequent natural disasters that could wipe out huge numbers of animals in a single event. Flooding was a massive problem. The Eromanga Sea was not a static body of water. It expanded and contracted based on sea levels and climate. When sea levels rose, which happened pretty regularly, the coastlines would flood rapidly. Rivers would overflow, low-lying areas would get swamped, and animals that were not paying attention would find themselves either swimming for their lives or drowning. There is actually fossil evidence of mass drownings. In one site, researchers found what looks like a group of dinosaurs that trampled each other trying to escape rising water. They did not make it. The flood caught them and they died in a panicked pile. Imagine being one of those dinosaurs. You are just going about your day, maybe eating some plants, hanging out with your herd, then suddenly the water starts rising, fast. You start moving toward higher ground, but so is everyone else. Panic sets in. Animals are pushing and shoving, some trip and get trampled. The water keeps coming, and then it is over. The whole herd goes down. Brutal way to go. But floods were not even the worst of it. Volcanic activity was ramping up during the later part of the Eromanga Sea's existence. The Australian continent was going through some major tectonic changes, and that meant volcanoes. On land, volcanic eruptions were terrifying enough. Ash clouds that blocked out the sun, lava flows that incinerated everything in their path, toxic gases, all the fun stuff. But in the sea, volcanism created a different kind of nightmare. Undersea volcanic activity triggered tsunamis, and not little ones. Massive walls of water that would come smashing into the coastlines with zero warning, sweeping away everything in their path. Imagine you are a titanosaur standing on the beach, and suddenly you see this enormous wave bearing down on you. You are 70 tons of solid dinosaur, and it does not matter. The wave picks you up like a toy and drags you out to sea. Maybe you survive the initial impact, but now you are in the water. Deep water. And remember what lives in that water? Chronosaurus, sharks, all the things that would love a free titanosaur meal. You were safer on land, even with the volcano going off. The volcanic activity had another effect too. The eruptions were causing the edges of the Australian continent to lift up, slowly at first, but steadily, and as the land rose, the Eromanga Sea started to drain. The water had nowhere to go, so it began flowing back towards the ocean. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the sea was shrinking. Animals that had adapted to this massive inland body of water suddenly found their habitat disappearing. Shallow areas became mudflats, then dry land. The marine creatures had to either move with the retreating water or adapt to new conditions. Most could not adapt fast enough. For the plesiosaurs, this was catastrophic. Chronosaurus and its relatives needed deep enough water to maneuver. As the sea got shallower and shallower, they found themselves stuck in smaller and smaller areas. Hunting became harder, breeding grounds disappeared, and eventually there just was not enough habitat left to sustain a population of 15-ton super predators. The same thing happened to the big sharks, the Ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs. They all depended on the sea, and when it started drying up, they were doomed. The process was not instant. It took thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands, but in geological terms, that is a blink, and by the time the Albian stage ended, around 100 million years ago, the Eromanga Sea was basically gone. What was left were vast floodplains, wetlands, and river systems. But that massive inland sea that had supported one of the most diverse and terrifying ecosystems on Earth, extinct, just like most of the animals that called it home. Now, let us talk about what daily life in the Eromanga Sea was actually like, because the sheer chaos of this place is hard to overstate. You had apex predators competing with each other constantly, Chronosaurus hunting everything in sight, including other Chronosaurus, sharks harassing anything that moved, Ichthyosaurs darting around snatching up squid and fish, plesiosaurs using their long necks to raid schools of prey. And every single one of these predators was also trying not to become prey themselves. The water clarity, or lack thereof, made everything more intense. Remember, the Eromanga Sea was murky. Visibility was terrible. That meant predators had to rely heavily on other senses: smell, vibration detection, electrical field sensing in the case of sharks. But it also meant ambush tactics were incredibly effective. You could have a 15-ton Chronosaurus sitting in murky water just a few meters away, and you would have no idea until it decided to move. And when it moved, it was already too late. The temperature added another layer of difficulty. Cold water, especially in the southern parts of the sea, meant animals needed higher metabolisms just to function. That meant eating more, which meant hunting more, which meant more competition, which meant more violence. It was a feedback loop that kept the whole system in a state of constant tension. There were no easy meals in the Eromanga Sea. Everything was a fight. And the seasonal changes made things even more unpredictable. During winter, when temperatures dropped toward freezing in the south, a lot of animals would migrate, move north to warmer waters, stick close to shallow areas where the sun could warm things up a bit. But that meant overcrowding. More predators in less space, more prey in less space, everyone competing for the same resources. The winter months in the Eromanga Sea must have been absolutely insane from a predator-prey interaction standpoint. Summer brought its own challenges. Warmer water meant algae blooms. Those created oxygen dead zones, areas where the water was so depleted of oxygen that fish would suffocate. For air-breathing reptiles like plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, this was not as big a problem, but it still affected their prey base. Less fish meant hungrier predators. Hungrier predators meant more aggressive hunting, more risk-taking, more injuries. The food web itself was incredibly complex. At the bottom, you had tiny plankton and small invertebrates. Those fed small fish and squid. The small fish and squid fed bigger fish and plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs. Those animals fed sharks and Chronosaurus. But then Chronosaurus also ate sharks. And sharks ate young Chronosaurus. And both of them ate ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. It was not a simple pyramid. It was a tangled mess of who eats who, with almost every large animal being both predator and prey depending on the situation. The coastal zones were equally chaotic. You had pterosaurs diving for fish, crocodilians waiting in the shallows, theropod dinosaurs patrolling the beaches, sauropods coming down to drink, ornithopods grazing on coastal vegetation, and all of them were vulnerable when they got near the water. A drinking sauropod could get grabbed by Chronosaurus if it waded too deep. A fishing pterosaur could get snatched out of the air by a leaping shark. A careless theropod could find itself face to face with a territorial crocodile. The boundaries between ecosystems were danger zones. Breeding added yet another dimension. Marine reptiles like Chronosaurus, the Ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs had to give birth in the water. Some species may have been viviparous, meaning they gave birth to live young. Others might have hauled themselves onto beaches to lay eggs, like sea turtles do today. Either way, the babies were incredibly vulnerable. Tiny plesiosaur babies in a sea full of hungry sharks and even hungrier adult plesiosaurs. The mortality rate must have been astronomical. Same for ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs. Most juveniles probably did not make it past their first year. This actually explains a lot about why Chronosaurus fossils show so much evidence of cannibalism. It was not necessarily that adult Chronosaurus were actively hunting juveniles of their own species. It is that juvenile Chronosaurus were just another food source in an environment where food was already competitive. An adult Chronosaurus probably did not care whether it was eating a young plesiosaur, a young ichthyosaur, or a young Chronosaurus. It was all just meat. And since juvenile Chronosaurus were less experienced and slower than adults, they made easy targets. Harsh, but that is nature, especially prehistoric Australian nature. The sharks probably had similar issues. Young sharks are vulnerable to basically everything. Adult sharks, Chronosaurus, even large fish like Protosphaerina could pose a threat to small sharks, so shark pups would have needed to stay in shallow nursery areas where bigger predators could not reach them. But even those areas were not safe. Crocodiles hunted in the shallows. pterosaurs hunted from above. There was no truly safe place in or around the Eromanga Sea. For the herbivores, life was slightly less intense but still dangerous. A titanosaur had very few natural predators once it reached adult size. You are not taking down a 70-ton animal easily, but juveniles were vulnerable. A young sauropod might be targeted by a pack of megaraptorans, or a large theropod, or even an opportunistic crocodile if it wandered too close to the water. And of course, environmental hazards were always a threat. Floods, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis. Just existing was a challenge. The ornithopods and other medium-sized herbivores had it worse. They were big enough to be worth hunting, but not big enough to be safe from most predators. They had to be constantly vigilant, always watching for movement in the trees, always listening for footsteps, always ready to run, and even then, something like an Australovenator could probably catch them anyway. Speed and sickle claws are a hard combination to escape from. The pterosaurs had the advantage of flight, which meant they could escape land and sea predators pretty easily, but they still had to come down to feed, and that made them vulnerable. A pterosaur diving for fish could misjudge the depth and end up too close to a shark. Or it could get ambushed by a crocodile hiding in shallow water, or it could get grabbed by Chronosaurus if it flew too low over deep water. Even the sky was not completely safe. Larger pterosaurs might have attacked smaller ones. Competition for nesting sites and food was fierce. And let us not forget the smaller creatures, the turtles, the cephalopods, the fish. They were all prey for something. Giant sea turtles, which could get pretty big, were still snacks for Chronosaurus. Regular-sized fish were food for basically everything. Squid and ammonites were eaten by ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and fish, and probably some theropods that ventured into the water. Nothing got a free pass. Everyone was on the menu for someone. The only animals that might have been relatively safe were the really small ones, tiny fish that could hide in coral or seaweed, small invertebrates that lived in the mud, things too small to be worth the effort for large predators. But even then, there were medium-sized predators specializing in exactly those kinds of prey. The food web went all the way down. From the tiniest plankton to the biggest Chronosaurus, everything was connected, and everything was eating or being eaten. That was the Eromanga Sea, a place where survival was not guaranteed for anyone. What makes the Eromanga Sea particularly fascinating from a scientific perspective is the sheer amount of fossil evidence we have found. This is not one of those prehistoric environments where we are working with a handful of bones and a lot of guesswork. We have got extensive fossil beds, trackways, bite marks, stomach contents, the works, and all of this evidence paints an incredibly detailed picture of what life was like in this ancient Australian death trap. The quality of fossil preservation in the Eromanga Basin is exceptional. The muddy, sediment-rich water that made the sea so murky when animals were alive actually worked in paleontology's favour after they died. When a creature sank to the bottom, it would get buried quickly in fine sediment. That rapid burial meant less decay and better preservation. We have found fossils with skin impressions, muscle tissue outlines, even stomach contents intact. This level of detail is incredibly rare and gives us insights we just would not have otherwise. Take the stomach content fossils, for example. When we find an ichthyosaur with its belly full of belemnites, we are not guessing about diet. We know exactly what it ate. When we find a crocodile with an ornithopod in its gut, we have direct evidence of predator-prey relationships. When we find a Chronosaurus with turtle shells and plesiosaur bones in its stomach, we can reconstruct feeding behavior with confidence. This is not speculation, this is hard data. And it tells us that the Eromanga Sea was even more brutal than we might have imagined. The The bite mark evidence is equally revealing. Bite marks on fossils are like prehistoric crime scenes. We can analyze the size, shape, and depth of the marks to figure out what made them. And in the Eromanga sea fossils, we see evidence of attacks from all kinds of predators. Shark bites on plesiosaurs. Plesiosaur bites on ichthyosaurs. Theropod bites on sauropods. Crocodile bites on dinosaurs. It is a catalogue of violence spanning millions of years. What is particularly interesting is that many of these bite marks show signs of healing. That tells us the animal survived the attack. A young Chronosaurus with healed shark bite marks on its jaw, that individual got attacked, survived, and lived long enough for the wound to heal. That gives us information about behavior. Young Chronosaurus were vulnerable to shark attacks, but they were tough enough to survive them sometimes. Adult Chronosaurus less so, because by the time they reached full size, very few things were brave enough to take a bite out of them. We also have pathologies, broken bones that healed wrong, infections, diseases. One Chronosaurus specimen shows evidence of a serious jaw infection, possibly from a tooth that broke and got infected. The animal survived with this injury for a while, but it probably affected its ability to hunt. Weakened predators would have faced increased competition and might have resorted to scavenging more than hunting, or they became prey themselves. A sick or injured Chronosaurus would have been vulnerable to attacks from other large predators, maybe even other Chronosaurus looking for an easy meal. The trackway evidence is another gold mine. Footprints preserved in ancient mud tell us about movement patterns and behavior. We have found sauropod trackways along the coastline, showing that these giants regularly walked the beaches. The tracks often appear in groups, suggesting sauropods travelled in herds. Some trackways show adults and juveniles together, indicating family groups. Others show only large individuals, which might have been bachelor herds or females without young. Theropod tracks are found in similar locations. Three-toed footprints that show these predators were patrolling the same beaches and shorelines that herbivores frequented, and occasionally you find theropod tracks following sauropod tracks, direct evidence of stalking behavior, a predator tracking its prey along the coast. We do not know if the hunt was successful, but we know it happened, and that is incredible. There are even tracks preserved underwater. Well, they were underwater when they were made. Now they are in rock formations that used to be the sea floor. These tracks show that large animals were walking through shallow areas of the Eromanga Sea, possibly sauropods taking shortcuts through shallow straits, possibly theropods wading through water to get to islands. Either way, these animals were regularly mixing aquatic and terrestrial environments. The line between land and sea was not just blurry, it was basically non-existent in many areas. The coprolites' fossilized feces provide yet another data source. Yeah, we are talking about ancient poop here, but it is actually super informative. Coprolites can contain bone fragments, scales, plant material, basically anything the animal ate that did not get fully digested. Large coprolites attributed to Chronosaurus have been found with bone fragments from multiple types of prey. This tells us Chronosaurus was not a specialist. It was an opportunistic generalist that ate whatever it could catch. Fish, reptiles, dinosaurs did not matter. If it had meat, it was on the menu. Pterosaur coprolites are mostly fish bones and scales, which confirms their primary diet, but some also contain remains of small reptiles or even juvenile dinosaurs, suggesting these flying giants occasionally grabbed land prey when the opportunity presented itself. Maybe a baby dinosaur that wandered too close to the water's edge, or a small lizard that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Pterosaurs were not above taking advantage of easy meals, even if fish was their main food source. The isotope analysis of fossilized bones adds another layer of understanding. By examining the ratios of different isotopes in bone material, scientists can determine what an animal ate, where it lived, and even whether it migrated seasonally. This technique has confirmed that plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs preferred the cooler southern waters of the Eromanga Sea. Their bone chemistry shows they spent most of their time there, only occasionally venturing north. Sharks, on the other hand, were more evenly distributed throughout the sea. Plesiosaurs showed the most variation, with some individuals staying in one area year-round and others migrating with the seasons. The age analysis of fossils is also revealing. By examining growth rings in bones and teeth, paleontologists can estimate how old an animal was when it died. This has shown that the Eromanga Sea had incredibly high juvenile mortality rates across the board. Most fossils are of young animals, juveniles and subadults. Full adults are actually relatively rare, especially among the predators. This makes sense when you think about the environment. So many things trying to eat you means most individuals do not make it to adulthood. The ones that do are the exceptions, the survivors who got lucky or were particularly skilled at avoiding predators. Chronosaurus shows this pattern clearly. Most Chronosaurus fossils are of individuals between 3 and 8 meters long, still big but not the massive 11 to 13 meter adults. This suggests many Chronosaurus got picked off when they were younger, either by sharks, by other marine predators, or by larger Chronosaurus. The adults were so big and powerful that they were relatively safe, but getting to that size was a gauntlet. Most did not make it. Sharks show similar patterns. Lots of juvenile and subadult shark fossils, fewer adults. For sharks, the danger came from all directions. Other sharks, Chronosaurus, large fish, even some pterosaurs might have grabbed shark pups from shallow water. Young sharks needed to be fast, lucky, and smart to survive. Most were not quite fast or lucky or smart enough. The sediment layers themselves tell a story. The Eromanga Sea went through cycles, periods where sea levels were high and the water was deep, followed by periods where levels dropped and shallow areas became exposed. These cycles affected the entire ecosystem. During high water times, there was more habitat, which meant populations could grow, but that also meant more competition when resources got tight. During low water times, animals were forced into smaller areas, intensifying competition even further, and the environmental stress from these fluctuations probably contributed to the extinction events we see in the fossil record. There is evidence of multiple die-off events during the Eromanga Sea's existence, layers where you suddenly find a lot of fossils all at once, suggesting something killed a large number of animals in a short period. These could have been caused by any number of things. Toxic algae blooms that depleted oxygen, disease outbreaks, rapid flooding that trapped animals, volcanic ash falls that poisoned the water, tsunamis that stirred up toxic sediments from the sea floor. Natural disasters in the Eromanga Sea could have been absolutely catastrophic when they happened. One particularly interesting site shows a mass death assemblage of marine reptiles, multiple species all dying in the same place at roughly the same time. Plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, sharks, fish, all jumbled together. The prevailing theory is that something, possibly an algae bloom or a sudden influx of fresh water from flooding, created a dead zone. The animals got trapped in water that could not support them and suffocated. Their bodies then sank to the bottom and got buried together. Horrific way to go, but it gave paleontologists a snapshot of the community composition at that moment in time. The geographic distribution of fossils also tells us about habitat preferences. Chronosaurus fossils are primarily found in deposits from the deeper southern parts of the sea. This aligns with the evidence that these giants preferred cold, deep water. Sharks are found pretty much everywhere, confirming they were generalists that could adapt to different conditions. Ichthyosaurs cluster in the south like plesiosaurs. Plesiosaurs are everywhere, showing their adaptability. Fish distribution varies by species, with some preferring open water and others sticking to coastal zones. On land, the distribution is equally telling. Sauropod fossils are concentrated near ancient river valleys and coastal plains. These were the areas with the most vegetation, so it makes sense herbivores would congregate there. Theropod fossils are found in similar locations because predators go where the prey is. Pterosaur fossils are often found near what would have been the coastline, close to their fishing grounds. Everything follows a logical pattern when you map it out. The ecosystem was structured in a way that maximized resource use but also created inevitable conflict. The seasonal patterns we can infer from all this evidence paint a picture of an ecosystem in constant flux. Summer meant warmer water, more productivity and more food, but also more algae blooms and oxygen problems. Winter meant colder water, less food and migration pressures. Animals had to be flexible and adaptable to survive the changing conditions. Those that could not adapt died out. It was natural selection in action, and it was brutal. What is really striking is how interconnected everything was. Changes in one part of the ecosystem rippled through the entire system. If a disease wiped out a lot of fish, the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs that ate fish would struggle. That might force them to hunt different prey, which would put pressure on other parts of the food web. If a volcanic eruption killed a lot of coastal vegetation, herbivores would suffer. That would mean less food for theropods, which might push theropods to hunt more aggressively or take more risks near the water, which might lead to more theropods becoming prey for Chronosaurus or sharks. Everything was connected. Nothing happened in isolation. When you compare the Eromanga Sea to modern ecosystems, the differences are staggering. Today's oceans have apex predators, sure, great white sharks, orcas, large saltwater crocodiles in some regions, but these animals exist in much lower densities than the predators in the Eromanga Sea. Modern oceans have relatively stable predator-to-prey ratios. The Eromanga Sea was lopsided toward predators in a way that would not work in most modern environments. So many things hunting, so many things eating each other, it should not have been sustainable, and yet it was, at least for millions of years. The question is why? Part of the answer probably lies in the unique conditions of the sea itself. The high productivity from all those nutrients meant there was an enormous base of primary producers, plankton, algae, aquatic plants, that supported massive populations of small fish and invertebrates. Those in turn supported the mid-level predators, and the mid-level predators supported the apex predators. The food web was hyper-productive at every level, which meant it could sustain more predators than a typical ecosystem, but it was a precarious balance. Any disruption could cascade through the entire system. The cold water also played a role. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. That means more energy available for organisms. Fish can be more active. Predators can hunt longer without tiring. The whole system runs hotter, metabolically speaking. But cold water also means animals need to eat more to maintain body temperature. So you have this situation where everyone is more active and everyone needs more food. It is a high-energy, high-stakes environment. No room for inefficiency. No room for weakness. The shallow depth of the sea created its own dynamics. Shallow water means light penetrates deeper, which means more photosynthesis, which means more productivity, but it also means nowhere to hide. Deep ocean animals can retreat to the abyss where predators cannot reach them. In the Eromanga Sea, there was no abyss. The deepest parts were still relatively shallow. You were always within reach of something that wanted to eat you. Pressure from above and below and all sides, constantly. The murky water was both an advantage and a disadvantage for everyone. Predators could ambush more easily, but they also had trouble finding prey. Prey could hide more easily, but they also had trouble seeing predators coming. It evened the playing field in some ways. Nobody had perfect information. Everyone was operating with incomplete data. That meant mistakes happened a lot, and mistakes in the Eromanga Sea were usually fatal. The isolation of the sea was another important factor. Being an inland sea meant limited connection to the open ocean. Animals that evolved in the Eromanga Sea were somewhat isolated from populations elsewhere. This allowed for unique adaptations specific to this environment, but it also meant genetic diversity might have been lower than in open ocean populations. Inbreeding could have been an issue for some species. And if a disease or environmental catastrophe hit, there were fewer sources for new individuals to replenish the population. It was a closed system, and closed systems are fragile. What is really interesting is how different groups of animals approach the same problems. Take the issue of catching fast-moving prey in murky water. Chronosaurus solved this with sheer power and a high metabolism that let it sustain bursts of speed. Sharks solved it with incredible sensory abilities that let them detect prey without seeing it. Ichthyosaurs solved it with hydrodynamic perfection that made them faster than almost anything else. Plesiosaurs solved it with stealth and that long neck that let them strike without telegraphing their intentions. Different solutions to the same problem, all effective, all coexisting in the same environment. Or consider the problem of reproduction. Giving birth in a sea full of hungry predators is not ideal. Chronosaurus probably addressed this by having large, well-developed babies that could fend for themselves relatively quickly, but even so, most juveniles got eaten. Sharks solved it by having lots of babies in protected nursery areas, accepting high mortality rates but ensuring some survived through sheer numbers. Ichthyosaurs might have given birth to single offspring or small litters, investing heavily in each individual. Plesiosaurs had their versatility, able to reproduce in different water types and potentially use freshwater refuges where marine predators could not reach. Every group had a strategy. None of them were perfect, but they worked well enough. Hunting strategies varied just as much. Chronosaurus was an ambush predator, but also active hunter. It probably cruised patrol routes looking for concentrations of prey, then accelerated in for the kill. That massive body could power through water surprisingly fast over short distances. And once it got close, the sheer momentum would be devastating. Imagine 15 tons hitting you at speed. You are not just getting bitten, you are getting smashed and bitten simultaneously. Sharks use different tactics depending on the species and the situation. Some probably patrolled actively, using their senses to detect distress signals from injured or dying animals. Others might have ambushed from below, using the murky water for cover. The giant Cretoxarina relatives could hit incredible speeds, so they might have used slash and retreat tactics. Bite the prey, swim away, wait for blood loss to weaken it, come back for another pass. Multiple sharks could have coordinated on large prey, though we do not have direct evidence of pack hunting, but modern sharks do it sometimes, so it is not out of the question. Ichthyosaurs were pursuit predators. They chased down prey in open water, using their speed advantage to run down squid and fish. Their large eyes suggest they hunted visually when possible, probably focusing on silhouettes or movement patterns. In murky water, they might have relied more on detecting vibrations or electrical fields, assuming they had those sensory capabilities. Their teeth were designed for gripping slippery prey, not for tearing or cutting. So they likely swallowed their catches whole or in large pieces. Plesiosaurs were sneaky hunters. That long neck was not just for looks. They could keep their body relatively still while moving the neck independently, minimizing disturbance in the water. Fish and squid would not see them coming until it was too late. The small teeth were perfect for holding onto small, slippery prey, and their ability to move between different water types meant they could exploit food sources other predators could not reach. Freshwater fish in rivers feeding the sea. Plesiosaurs could hunt them. Brackish water species in estuaries. Plesiosaurs were on it. They were opportunists in the best sense. The fish predators, like Protosphaerina, used specialized techniques. That blade-like rostrum and those cutting teeth were designed for a specific type of attack. High-speed ramming. The fish would accelerate to maximum velocity and torpedo itself into the side of a prey animal, slicing it in half with the impact. This required incredible precision and timing. Miss your angle by a degree or two and you might break your face instead of slicing your target. But when it worked, it was devastatingly effective. One hit kills on prey that might otherwise be hard to bring down. Pterosaurs employed aerial hunting strategies. They would soar over the water, scanning for fish near the surface. When they spotted something, they would dive, extending their legs and grabbing the fish with their feet, or in some cases, plunging their beaks into the water and snacking fish with their teeth. The large species could probably handle pretty big fish, small sharks even. Anything cruising near the surface was potentially on the menu. And with wingspans over 20 feet, these pterosaurs could cover huge areas, scanning miles of coastline every day. Crocodilians were ambush specialists. They would lie in the shallows, completely still, looking like logs or rocks. When something came close enough, they would explode into action. That sudden burst of speed from a standstill is what makes crocodilians so dangerous. You do not see them until they are already moving, and by then it is too late. Their jaws clamp down and they start the death roll, using rotational force to tear chunks off prey or drag it underwater to drown. Simple but brutally effective. Theropods on land had their own methods. Megaraptorans like Australovenator used a combination of speed and weaponry. They could run down prey that tried to flee, and once they caught up, those massive hand claws would come into play, slash across the flank, hamstringing tendons, impale through the ribcage, puncturing organs, multiple rapid strikes from different angles, overwhelming the prey's defenses. It was not a clean kill. It was a frenzied assault designed to bring down the target as fast as possible before it could fight back effectively or escape. Larger theropods, if they were present, would have used different tactics. Big, powerful jaws for biting and holding, maybe bone-crushing bites if they were built for it, or maybe slashing bites that caused massive bleeding. Different species, different approaches, but the goal was always the same: bring down the prey, eat, survive another day. The defensive strategies were just as varied. Sauropods relied on size. Once you are 70 tons, not much can hurt you, but they probably also used their tails as weapons. Whip that tail around and you could break bones or crush skulls. Younger sauropods might have stayed in the middle of herds where adults could protect them, and they might have avoided water or only approached it in groups, reducing individual risk. Ornithopods used speed and awareness. They were built to run, and they probably did a lot of it. Staying in groups helped too, more eyes watching for danger, and if a predator attacked, there was safety in numbers. The predator can only chase one individual. Everybody else scatters. Someone gets caught, but most survive. Cold calculus, but effective. Armored dinosaurs like ankylosaurs had built-in defenses, thick bony plates covering their bodies, tail clubs that could shatter bones. If a predator attacked, they could hunker down and wait it out. The predator might try for a while, but eventually would give up and find easier prey. Armor does not help you run, but it helps you survive being attacked. Marine creatures had their own defensive adaptations. Some fish schools tightly, making it hard for predators to single out individuals. Others used speed to escape. Still others relied on camouflage, blending into the murky water. Giant turtles had their shells, though as we know from Chronosaurus stomach contents, shells were not always enough. Ammonites had their spiral shells, which provided some protection, but also made them easy targets for shell-crushing jaws. Every adaptation was an arms race against predator adaptations. Nothing was a guarantee, but every little advantage helped. The communication and social behavior of these animals is harder to reconstruct, but we can make some educated guesses based on modern analogues and fossil evidence. Sauropods likely had vocalizations, possibly low-frequency rumbles that could travel long distances. This would help herds stay coordinated. Theropods might have used calls to coordinate hunts or establish territories. Pterosaurs probably had complex vocalizations for mating and social interactions. The Eromanga Sea shorelines must have been incredibly noisy places. The calls of pterosaurs, the bellows of sauropods, the hisses of theropods, the splashing of marine animals. It would have been a symphony of prehistoric sounds, terrifying but fascinating. Below the surface, communication would have been different. Sharks can detect electrical fields and vibrations, so they might have used those for communication. Pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs might have used vocalizations, though we do not know for sure. Some modern marine reptiles like sea turtles make sounds, so it is possible. Chemical communication through pheromones might have played a role too. Leaving scent trails or chemical signals in the water to mark territories or attract mates. We will probably never know the full extent of their communication abilities, but there was definitely more going on than just physical interactions. As the Eromanga Sea entered its final phase, the changes were gradual at first, but accelerated over time. The volcanic activity that was lifting the continental edges also caused other problems. Ashfalls poisoned sections of the water. Lava flows that reached the sea created localized heating events that killed off temperature-sensitive species, and the tsunamis kept coming, each one reshaping the coastlines and disrupting established communities. But the biggest change was the steady shrinking of the sea itself. Year by year, decade by decade, the water retreated, and with it went the habitat that so many species depended on. For the sessile organisms, the ones that could not move, this was a death sentence. Coral colonies, sponge beds, shellfish attached to rocks. As the water level dropped, they found themselves high and dry, exposed to air, baking in the sun, and then dead. Their loss had cascading effects. These organisms provided habitat structure for countless other species. Small fish that hid in coral, invertebrates that lived among sponges, predators that hunted in these complex environments. When the foundation species died, everything built on top of them collapsed too. Mobile animals could relocate, but only to a point. As the sea shrank, the remaining water became more and more crowded. Population densities increased, competition intensified. Resources that were once spread across a huge area were now concentrated in a much smaller space. This created a pressure cooker environment. More predators in less space meant more conflicts. More prey in less space meant they were easier to find, but also meant food for prey species was harder to come by. Everything was compressed into a tighter and tighter area, and tensions escalated. The shallow areas disappeared first. Mudflats that had been prime feeding grounds for certain species became dry land. Rivers that had fed into the sea started carving through the exposed seafloor instead of flowing into open water. Estuaries where fresh and salt water mixed became just rivers. Brackish water zones vanished, and all the species that depended on these specific conditions had to either adapt, migrate, or die. Most chose to migrate, but there was only so far they could go before they ran out of suitable habitat. Plesiosaurs probably fared better than most during this transitional period. Their ability to tolerate different water salinities meant they could follow the retreating water into increasingly isolated pockets. Some populations might have ended up trapped in landlocked lakes that persisted after the main sea was gone, cut off from the ocean, unable to breed with other populations. These isolated groups would have eventually died out as the lakes themselves dried up or became too small to support large predators, but they might have lasted decades or even centuries after the main sea disappeared. Evolutionary dead ends, but survivors nonetheless for a time. Ichthyosaurs did not have that luxury. They were marine specialists. They needed open water with robust prey populations. As the sea fragmented into smaller and smaller bodies of water, ichthyosaur populations became isolated too. Genetic diversity decreased. Inbreeding problems probably emerged, and as prey populations crashed in the shrinking water, ichthyosaurs faced starvation. Some might have tried to migrate to the ocean following rivers downstream. But the journey would have been treacherous. Shallow water, predators, and no guarantee of success even if they made it. The ichthyosaurs in the Eromanga Sea were among the last of their kind globally. When they went extinct here, it was part of a worldwide decline that would eventually wipe out the entire group. Chronosaurus faced similar problems. These massive predators needed huge amounts of food and a lot of space. As the sea shrank, both became scarce. Chronosaurus populations would have declined rapidly. Fewer breeding pairs meant fewer juveniles, and the juveniles that were born faced even higher mortality rates because the crowded conditions meant more competition from other predators, including other Chronosaurus. It was a vicious cycle. Less habitat led to fewer animals, which led to breeding problems, which led to even fewer animals. Eventually, the population would have crashed below viable levels. The last Chronosaurus might have lived in a small remnant pocket of the sea, hunting the last remaining fish and plesiosaurs, until finally there was just not enough food left. And then it too would have died. End of an era. The sharks might have had a better chance. Some species could potentially have migrated back to the ocean. Sharks are adaptable. They can handle different temperatures and salinities, and they do not need as much space as something like Chronosaurus. But the giant species, the ones that had grown to enormous sizes in the Eromanga Sea, probably could not make the transition. They were too specialized for the conditions in the inland sea. The open ocean had different dynamics, different prey, different competition. A 9-meter shark that dominated the Eromanga Sea might have struggled in the ocean against established shark populations. Some probably tried, most probably failed, and the lineages that had thrived in the Eromanga Sea went extinct. On land, the changes were less immediately catastrophic, but still significant. The shrinking sea meant changing habitats on the coast. Wetlands dried up, coastal forests gave way to grasslands or scrubland. The rich biodiversity that the sea had supported indirectly started to decline. Herbivore populations probably decreased as vegetation changed, and predator populations followed suit. Some species adapted to the new conditions. Others moved to different regions where conditions were still favourable, and some went extinct locally, disappearing from the Australian fossil record even though they might have survived elsewhere. The titanosaurs were probably okay. They were widespread across multiple continents and could adapt to different environments. The Australian populations might have struggled as habitats changed, but the species as a whole were not threatened by the loss of the Eromanga Sea. Same with many of the other dinosaur groups. They were cosmopolitan, found in multiple regions, and could relocate if necessary. But some endemic species, ones found only in Australia or only around the Eromanga Sea, would have been in trouble. We might have lost unique lineages that never got a chance to spread elsewhere. Pterosaurs faced challenges too. The fish stocks that had supported such large flying reptiles were depleting. Smaller bodies of water meant less fish, and the giant pterosaurs with their 7 to 9 meter wingspans needed a lot of food. They might have tried to switch to different prey, land animals, carrion, but their adaptations were for fishing. Trying to hunt terrestrial prey would have been difficult and inefficient. Pterosaur populations probably declined in the region. And eventually, the giant-toothed species that had been so successful in the Eromanga Basin disappeared. They were already evolutionary dead ends globally, the last of their kind, and the loss of the Eromanga Sea probably accelerated their demise. Crocodilians were probably fine. They are survivors. They have been around for over 200 million years, and they have weathered countless environmental changes. As the Eromanga Sea dried up, crocodiles would have just moved to the rivers and lakes that remained. They are highly adaptable and can handle a wide range of conditions. The specific species in the Eromanga region might have gone extinct or evolved into new forms, but crocodilians as a group would have persisted, and they did. Australia still has crocodiles today, different species but the same basic body plan and lifestyle. If it works, why change? The transition from inland sea to dry land took probably thousands of years. It was not an overnight event, but in geological terms it was rapid, and the fossil record reflects this. We see a rich diversity of marine species in the middle Cretaceous layers. Then, as we move up through the rock toward the late Cretaceous, that diversity starts to decline. Fewer marine reptile fossils, fewer shark fossils, more terrestrial fossils. The ecosystem was transforming. What had been a marine-dominated environment became a terrestrial one, and the animals that could not make that transition vanished from the record. What is interesting is that some ecological niches remained unfilled after the marine species went extinct. There were no large marine reptiles in Australia for a long time after the Eromanga Sea disappeared. The ocean eventually moved back in as sea levels rose again. But the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs were gone forever. Mosasaurs, which would come to dominate late Cretaceous seas elsewhere, never really established themselves in Australian waters to the same extent. The specific conditions that made the Eromanga Sea such a hotspot for marine reptiles never quite repeated. It was a unique moment in time, a perfect storm of factors that created one of the most extreme ecosystems ever, and then it was gone. The legacy of the Eromanga Sea lives on in the fossil record. The rocks of the Eromanga Basin are some of the richest fossil-bearing formations in Australia. Paleontologists have been digging there for over 100 years, and we are still finding new species. Every expedition turns up something interesting. A new dinosaur, a previously unknown marine reptile, better preserved specimens of known species. The fossils keep coming, and each one adds another piece to the puzzle of what life was like in this ancient inland sea. Museums around the world have specimens from the Eromanga Basin, Chronosaurus skulls, Ichthyosaur skeletons, plesiosaur fossils, dinosaur bones. You can see them on display and get a sense of just how massive and terrifying these animals were. But even the best museum display cannot really capture what it must have been like to be there, to see a living Chronosaurus powering through the water, to watch a pterosaur with a 30-foot wingspan glide over the waves, to hear the calls of dinosaurs echoing across the coastal plains. We can reconstruct the environment, we can piece together the behaviors, but we can never truly experience it. We can only imagine. And what an imagination exercise it is. Close your eyes and picture it. You are standing on the shore of the Eromanga Sea. The water is murky, almost brown. The surface is calm, but you know what is lurking beneath. Chronosaurus, sharks, ichthyosaurs, things that would kill you in seconds if you stepped into the water. Behind you, coastal forest, but not safe either. Theropods prowling, crocodiles in the shallows. Overhead, massive pterosaurs circling. The air is warm but not hot. There is a breeze coming off the water. In the distance, you hear something, a deep rumbling call, maybe a sauropod, maybe something else. The sound carries across the landscape, low and ominous. You watch the water, waiting, and then you see it. A disturbance on the surface, something big moving just below. The water ripples, and then a head breaks the surface, massive, longer than a car, jaws that could bite you in half without effort. Chronosaurus. It breaches partially, water cascading off its body, and then slides back under with barely a splash. It is hunting, looking for prey, and for a moment you are grateful you are on land, but then you remember, land is not safe either. Nowhere is safe. This is the Eromanga Sea. This is prehistoric Australia, and everything here is designed to kill. The scientific value of the Eromanga Sea goes way beyond just knowing what lived there. This ecosystem teaches us fundamental lessons about how life works under extreme conditions, how predators and prey coexist when the balance seems impossibly skewed, how ecosystems respond to environmental stress, how extinction happens. These are not just historical curiosities. They are insights that apply to modern conservation and ecology. When we look at the Eromanga Sea, we are looking at a natural experiment that ran for millions of years, and the results are still relevant today. One of the biggest lessons is about tipping points. The Eromanga Sea ecosystem seemed stable for a long time, millions of years of relative consistency, predators and prey in equilibrium, birth rates and death rates balanced, but then conditions changed and the whole system collapsed relatively quickly. The sea shrank, habitats fragmented, populations declined below sustainable levels, and suddenly species that had thrived for eons were gone. This pattern of long stability followed by rapid collapse is something we see in modern ecosystems too. Coral reefs that seem fine until suddenly they are not. Fish populations that crash after decades of over-harvesting. The warning signs are often subtle until you cross a threshold, then everything cascades. The Eromanga Sea also demonstrates the importance of habitat connectivity. When the sea was intact, animals could move freely. Gene flow between populations kept diversity high. If conditions got bad in one area, animals could relocate. But when the sea fragmented, populations became isolated. Islands of habitat in a sea of dry land, which is ironic. Those isolated populations lost genetic diversity. They could not recover from local disasters, and they went extinct one by one. Modern conservation biology has learned this lesson. Fragmented habitats are death sentences for many species. You need corridors, you need connectivity. The Eromanga Sea fossils prove this principle in rock. Another insight comes from the sheer diversity of predators that coexisted. In modern ecosystems, you typically have one or two apex predators and then a cascade of smaller predators below them, but the Eromanga Sea had multiple apex-level predators all operating in the same space. Chronosaurus, giant sharks, large Ichthyosaurs to some extent, and they all made it work. How? Probably through niche partitioning, subtle differences in diet, hunting times, preferred depths, temperature preferences. Enough separation that they were not directly competing all the time, but also enough overlap that conflicts were inevitable. This tells us that even highly competitive environments can support multiple top predators if resources are abundant enough, but it is a precarious balance. Remove one predator and the others might explode in population and overexploit the prey base. Add too many predators and nobody gets enough food. The Eromanga Sea hit a sweet spot, but only under specific conditions that eventually ceased to exist. The fossil record from the Eromanga Basin also highlights something scientists call Lagerstätten, which is a German word for exceptionally preserved fossil sites. These are places where conditions were just right for detailed preservation. And when you have detailed preservation, you get detailed information. We do not just know what lived in the Eromanga Sea, we know what they ate, how they died, what injuries they survived, how fast they grew, what diseases they had. This level of detail is rare in paleontology. Most fossil sites give you fragments, scattered bones, partial skeletons if you are lucky, but Lagerstätten give you the whole story. The Eromanga Basin is one of these special sites, and every time paleontologists dig there, they are potentially finding evidence that rewrites our understanding of Cretaceous ecosystems. What is particularly exciting is that we are still in the early stages of exploring the Eromanga Basin. Australia is a huge country with vast areas that are remote and difficult to access. There are probably dozens, maybe hundreds of fossil sites that have not been discovered yet. Every rainy season exposes new fossils as erosion washes away sediment. Farmers and ranchers occasionally find bones on their property. And when paleontologists get the resources to conduct expeditions, they almost always find something significant. The next big discovery could be just sitting there in the outback, waiting for someone to notice it. Maybe a new species of plesiosaur, maybe evidence of behaviours we have not seen before, maybe something completely unexpected that changes the whole narrative. The potential is enormous. Comparing the Eromanga Sea to other Cretaceous inland seas is also illuminating. The Western Interior Seaway in North America was larger and lasted longer. It had its own suite of marine reptiles, including mosasaurs, which never made it to the Eromanga Sea. The two ecosystems were contemporary for part of their existence, but evolved independently. Different predators, different dynamics. The Western Interior Seaway was warmer and had better connection to the open ocean. The Eromanga Sea was colder and more isolated, and those differences resulted in distinct communities. It is like parallel experiments in evolution, and comparing them tells us what factors drive ecosystem structure. The Tethys Sea, which was the main ocean during the Cretaceous, had yet another set of communities. Enormous marine reptiles, including some of the largest mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, different sharks, different fish, and because it was a true ocean, not an inland sea, the dynamics were different again. More stable water chemistry, better buffering against environmental changes, but also more competition from open ocean specialists. The Eromanga sea creatures were playing in a smaller pond, but they were the biggest fish in that pond. In the Tethys, they would have been mid-tier predators at best. Modern Australia still has dangerous waters, but nothing like the Eromanga Sea. The Great Barrier Reef is one of the most biodiverse marine environments on Earth, but the predators there are measured in kilograms, not tons. Great white sharks patrol the coasts and are impressive animals. But a big great white is maybe 2 tons max. Chronosaurus was 15 tons, 7 times heavier. Saltwater crocodiles are the apex predators in northern estuaries and rivers. They can be truly massive, over 1,000 pounds, but even the biggest ones are a fraction of the size of the marine predators that used to live in Australia. The modern fauna is tame by comparison, which is probably good for anyone who likes swimming. That said, Australia's modern reputation for dangerous wildlife is not entirely undeserved. Box jellyfish, blue-ringed octopus, cone snails, taipans, funnel web spiders, stonefish. The country has a disproportionate number of venomous species, and while they are not as large or overtly terrifying as Chronosaurus, they are arguably more dangerous to humans because they are small and easy to encounter accidentally. Step on a stonefish and you are in for a world of hurt. Get stung by a box jellyfish and you might not make it. Touch a blue-ringed octopus and you could be dead in minutes. Size is not everything when it comes to danger. Sometimes the small things are the ones you really need to worry about. But there is something uniquely terrifying about the idea of massive predators, something primal. We can rationalize the danger of a small, venomous creature. Do not touch it, problem solved. But a 15-ton predator that can bite you in half, you can not just avoid it. It could come for you, actively hunt you, and there would be nothing you could do. That kind of danger taps into deep evolutionary fears. Our ancestors spent millions of years avoiding large predators, lions, tigers, bears, giant crocodiles, and we still carry those instincts, which is why stories of prehistoric mega-predators fascinate us. They are manifestations of our deepest fears, but they are also safely extinct, which makes them perfect subjects for morbid curiosity. The question that always comes up is, could something like the Eromanga Sea exist today? Could we have an inland sea full of massive predators in the modern world? The answer is technically yes, but practically no. The geological conditions that created the Eromanga Sea could happen again. Rising sea levels, flooding of low-lying continental areas, creation of an inland sea. We have seen this pattern repeat throughout Earth's history. But the biological conditions would be much harder to replicate. The Eromanga Sea was a product of millions of years of evolution. The species that lived there were specifically adapted to those exact conditions. You could not just flood a modern landmass and expect giant marine reptiles to show up. Evolution does not work that fast. Plus, the modern world is fundamentally different. Humans dominate the planet. We would not allow a giant inland sea to form without trying to control it. We would build dams, drain sections for agriculture, pollute it with industrial runoff. Even if the geological conditions were right, that the ecological conditions would be all wrong. The Eromanga Sea existed in a world before humans, before industry, before mass extinctions caused by anthropogenic factors. That world is gone. And it is never coming back. We can only study the fossils and imagine what it must have been like. There is a philosophical dimension to this too. The Eromanga Sea reminds us of our place in the grand scheme of time. Humans have been around for maybe 300,000 years, anatomically modern humans at least. Civilization for 10,000 years. The Eromanga Sea existed for millions of years. It rose and fell and left its mark on the earth long before any human ever walked upright, and the animals that lived there were successful in ways we can barely comprehend. Chronosaurus existed as a species for how long? We do not know exactly, but probably hundreds of thousands of years at least, maybe over 1 million. That is evolutionary success. Those animals were not less than us just because they are extinct. They were products of the same evolutionary processes that produced us. They were complex, they were adapted, they were successful until they were not. And someday humans will not be either. That is not pessimism. That is just reality. All species go extinct eventually. It is the one thing evolution guarantees. But while species come and go, the processes continue. Evolution keeps happening. Ecosystems keep forming and collapsing and reforming. The Earth keeps changing. Right now, we are living in what some scientists call the Anthropocene, the age of humans. We are the dominant force shaping the planet. Our actions determine which species thrive and which go extinct. We are creating an extinction event comparable to the one that killed the dinosaurs. But unlike past mass extinctions, this one is happening because of the activities of a single species, us. And unlike past mass extinctions, we have the ability to do something about it. We can choose different paths. We can protect habitats. We can reduce our impact. We can decide what the future looks like. The animals of the Eromanga Sea did not get that choice. They were at the mercy of geological forces they could not control. We have the luxury of agency. The question is whether we will use it. Looking at the Eromanga Sea fossils, it is hard not to feel a sense of loss. These incredible animals, these complex ecosystems, all gone, reduced to bones in rock, but there is also something inspiring about it. Life persisted. After the Eromanga Sea dried up, life found new forms. New species evolved. New ecosystems developed. The specific animals changed, but the fundamental processes continued. Life is resilient. It adapts. It survives. It finds a way. That is the real lesson of the Eromanga Sea. Not that extinction is inevitable, though it is, but that life continues, evolution continues, the story keeps going. The Eromanga Sea was one chapter. We are living in another chapter right now, and there will be chapters after us. The fossils remind us of that continuity. They connect us to a deep past and hint at a future we will never see, but which will happen nonetheless. So the next time you hear about Australia's dangerous wildlife, remember the Eromanga Sea. Remember that as scary as modern Australia might seem, it used to be so much worse. Remember Chronosaurus, the 15-ton cannibal that ruled an inland sea. Remember the sharks that grew to the size of buses. Remember the Ichthyosaurs making their last stand. Remember the pterosaurs with 30-foot wingspans. Remember the megaraptorans with their sickle claws. And remember that all of this existed in the same place at the same time for millions of years. The Eromanga Sea was real. The fossils prove it. And it was probably the single most terrifying ecosystem to ever exist on this planet. Modern Australia with its venomous spiders and snakes? That is nothing compared to what used to be there. We got off easy. The animals did not. But their story is preserved. And as long as we keep digging up those fossils, keep studying them, keep learning from them, they are not truly extinct. They live on in our understanding. They inform our science. They inspire our imagination. And they remind us that life on Earth has always been dangerous, dramatic, and absolutely incredible. The Eromanga Sea is gone. But its legacy remains, and that